Welcome to Liberty Nation's Conservative 5 with a twist. The twist being that with our guest today, Mr. Tim Donner, Senior Political Analyst of LibertyNation.com, and Mr. Dave Patterson, former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller and Air Force pilot, they make two guests each. So therefore, for those of us going 2 + 2 = 5, is we do the maths ourselves, and welcome to our Conservative 5 special edition on the Ukraine war. Now, I've invited these two guests in to join me, your host, Mark Angelides, specifically because they have a unique set of analytical skills. Dave is an expert in all things defense and military. Tim has a keen political mind in terms of political analysis to look at the interplays between state actors and foreign and domestic situations like none other. And me, I'm just here because I fill in the blanks. So, gentlemen, thanks for being here.
Great to be with you, Mark.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
So I think maybe for the first off, if we get our situations, our perspectives on the Ukraine situation, the war in Ukraine as it sits today, and maybe put out a couple of things that you'd like to discuss further on that. Let's start with Dave. Dave, you've been writing on the pages of LibertyNation.com about this war from, in fact, before the war started, pointing out what's about to happen. And for anybody who thinks the State Department couldn't have known, well, they should have just read LibertyNation.com. Dave, what's your take as we approach almost 2 years in the war?
Well, I think the big battle is going to be within, the biggest battle is, of course, within the United States, and the Biden administration's fight with Congress over money. And
sorry, Dave, I'm gonna jump in and interrupt straight away. So the biggest battle here, you mean that Ukraine can't continue to wage its defensive war against Russia without American support? Is that the angle we're coming at?
Yeah, well, that's what the Biden administration would like you to believe, and the problem is that they've crafted the argument wrong. They blame Congress for dragging its feet over the what is now $111 billion that's been, as the Office of Management and Budget said in a letter recently to Congress, that's been allocated, and it includes, $67 billion for military procurement funding and $27 for economic and civilian assistance, and it's that tranche, this $27 billion, that is really stuck in Congress's craw, because it funds basically the administration and the government of Ukraine, to include things like pension funds and the salaries of government workers. And then there's $10 billion for humanitarian aid. But the issue really is that the Biden administration has never, not one time, explained what their strategy is and how that money is going to eventually end up in some sort of end state that will be of mutually beneficial, or at least give Ukraine some satisfaction that the losses of all their people have been worth it.
That's I really think that as you say, the $27 billion that's being used to fund politicians' pensions whilst war's being waged there, and it's the politicians that are, you'd imagine that they're in this position of great responsibility, but it's something that they asked for. They didn't accidentally get elected to office. They sought this knowing full well, and that they should be fighting without having to worry about, well, what about my 401k? What about my nest egg? It's a terrible, it's terrible optics, isn't it? Which I guess brings us to the political. Tim, what's your take on it?
I'll tell you what, when it comes to funding for Ukraine, the combination of globalists, neoconservatives, establishment Democrats will try to make the argument that as much as we've spent on Ukraine, which, as Dave pointed out, is over $110 billion, it's only 3% of the defense budget. So that by itself is used as a defense for continuing to fund Ukraine. I mean, look, the fact is, and I think everybody believes this, most of all the voters, no idea where this money is going, how it's being spent, whether it's going down a rat hole. Americans are already very wary of foreign aid. We have troops stationed in over 100 countries across the globe. The defense budget is enormous, which by itself makes spending a mere 110 billion on Ukraine appear to be not really such a huge investment. But I think from a political standpoint, the question that people need to be asking more than anything else is, as we approach the 2028 election,
2024. You're predicting the war is going to continue till 2027.
Well, I think we already have the outlines of the 2020 campaign with Ron DeSantis,
Gavin Newsom,
Gavin Newsom having had their debate last week. But the question people need to ask themselves as they consider who they want to be the president come January of 2025 is, would Ukraine have been invaded by Russia if Donald Trump was in the White House? And too many times people do not ask this question. During the Bush years, Putin made his incursion into Crimea. He later made an incursion into Georgia. Actually, it was Georgia under Bush. And then an incursion into Crimea under Obama. And then a full-scale invasion of Ukraine under Biden. What do you see missing there? You see the Trump years, the 4 years Trump was in office. Putin was put back in his box to some degree. Now, people can argue why, but the fact is we had peace beyond all measure compared to the rest of the 21st century when Donald Trump was president. And he has played a little bit close to the vest as to how he would handle the war in Ukraine. But of course, he's already been suspected of having pro-Putin leanings, right? We went through
suspected by Hillary Clinton when she paid for the dodgy false dossier from Christopher Steele to actually pinpoint that on him. Yeah,
right, exactly. But I think the point is we had no wars under Donald Trump, and now we have two grinding ground wars under Joe Biden. And it's almost impossible to separate those two ground wars from the weakness of Joe Biden.
I'd like to come back on that, Tim. So I think that's a really good point. You're right. People don't ask the question about why didn't this happen under Donald Trump? And if they do, they're dismissive, saying it just wasn't the right time, or because Putin already had his man in the White House, which is the most disingenuous of responses to there. But I'd like to put forward my opinion on why he didn't do anything during the Trump years. And that's simply because Donald Trump would see no value in extending the conflict, because he wouldn't. Now, that's not to say that Donald Trump would be strong enough to push back at Vladimir Putin, because we don't know that for sure. We can't know that for sure. But there's no advantage for Donald Trump to become a wartime president. There's no political advantage in that for him. So for Trump, I mean, we look at him with the Abraham Accords, which arguably, Joe Biden has been ignoring up until this point because he didn't want to give Donald Trump the credit for the Abraham Accords. And look what happened. We end up with a war in Israel.
In fairness, that's not entirely true, because Biden was trying to bring Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accord universe, so to speak. And of course,
but not the Abraham Accords. He wanted the Biden Accords.
No, of course not.
So the good work done under the Abraham Accords. But anyway, we digress to the Israel situation. But what we do know is that Donald Trump wouldn't have seen a political benefit in being a wartime president, because he was already popular among his own party. And whereas with Joe Biden, there is an advantage for him to be seen as a wartime president because the economy is tanking.
Well, let's go back to the South Carolina primary in 2016 when Donald Trump was up against a gaggle of opponents, including, Jeb Bush and Ted Cruz and all the rest of them. And Donald Trump said right there in front of a fully Republican audience, essentially that George W. Bush was, if not a war criminal, someone who had started a war that was entirely unnecessary. He laid his so-called, I suppose you'd call it pacifist credentials on the line. And I remember watching it and saying, I think Donald Trump just lost the South Carolina primary because you can't go into a Republican primary and attack the last Republican president. Well, Trump went on to win by 10 points in South Carolina. And I think that gave him the clear message that his voters and voters in general are sick and tired of war and incursions into other countries and expanding conflicts and getting the U.S. involved at any cost. And Joe Biden has always been suspected of not seeing a war that he doesn't like. So, he's got quite a burden to carry.
Or a foreign policy decision he wasn't ready to blow up.
Well, look, here was, Dave, I was struck, and I got to get your reaction to this. And it doesn't regard Ukraine particularly, but you have to assume that the reaction was largely the same within the Biden administration with Ukraine when Biden was talking with Putin. You go to Iran during the Israeli war and you're asked, John Kirby, the State Department spokesman, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, the president, what is your message to Iran? One word: don't. They kept repeating, don't. Dave Patterson, do you think that is an effective strategy to deter Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the rest of the savages who attacked Israel on October 7th?
No, of course not. I mean, this administration has a propensity to be too cute by half. This idea of just, don't. Well, I mean, honestly, I think going back to your discussion about would Trump have, it's always dangerous in doing hypotheticals. But if you see Trump, former President Trump, as a transactional pragmatist, in other words, he is always about the transaction, the discussion, the deal, if you will. When the first 60,000 troops showed up on Ukraine's border, he would have gone into the transaction then. He would not have just simply said, oh, look, isn't that nice? I mean, they can move their troops to a neighbor's border. No, that was the time when the sanctions should have been put in place. That is the time when the United States and NATO should have had an exercise to demonstrate exactly what would happen if
an exercise, yes.
Right, but instead, what Biden said was, well, if it's just a minor invasion, we're not really going to
minor incursion.
I mean, that's just incredible. It's incredible that a president of the United States, in this case, the commander-in-chief, could say, well, as long as the incursion isn't too big, I don't think we're going to do anything about it. Boy,
well Tim, actually,
to the world.
The loss of Luhansk and Donbass and the Crimea in Biden's calculus would be a minor incursion, right?
Right. Yes. And since they're mostly Russian-speaking residents there anyway, it's largely Russian. It belonged to Russia for a long time, so we can just let them take it back.
I haven't forgotten the 600 who fought to save the Crimea in the charge of the Light Brigade. I haven't forgotten them. Sorry,
The
Dave,
charge of the
continue with
Light
your
Brigade.
point.
Yeah, well, I think that the point was that throughout that first year, 2021, Biden had opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to make the case to Putin in a way that would have been very strong and unyielding. And what did he do? He failed to make the case before the June meeting, his summit meeting with Putin. And then after, what did the two sides do? In July, Putin puts out his manifesto, which tells the world precisely what he's going to do and why. And Biden stops military aid to Ukraine. I mean, that was unbelievably foolish by any manner of measure. And then, of course, he goes on to screw up Afghanistan. And the point, I guess, is that all of this Biden nonsense in foreign policy has left the American people with absolutely no confidence whatsoever in the geopolitical capability of this administration, and rightly so.
And here's the thing, Dave, it's only been compounded with the response to, what is it, over 70 targeted attacks on Americans and American facilities in this broader Israel-Hamas war, with Iran being involved. I mean, we have had our troops targeted. We had Americans killed on October 7th. We have Hezbollah playing footsie with northern Israel. We have Hamas refusing to let so many of its civilians out of Gaza, sending them to their certain death. All of this. And what does the Biden administration do? They bomb a bunch of empty storage facilities in the middle of the night. You know what? Of the possible responses, and you could talk better on this, Dave, but of the possible responses, this to me was the worst possible response, because it sends the message that Joe Biden is a coward when it comes to foreign policy. He does not have the guts to engage a declared enemy of the United States. And what more can you say if you have a president who isn't willing to engage a fight when his country is being taunted, literally taunted by Iran, and he can't respond to it? It would have been better, in my opinion, if he did nothing and sent the message that he was preparing a major response. But by these little pinpricks, and that's even a generous term, he's sending the message that we're not really willing to do anything to accept our responsibility that we've made to Israel and to our people to keep them safe there and here.
Okay, we're going to address that as soon as we get back after this short break. Don't go anywhere.